Zora already so beautifully spoke about the parasha, the Torah reading that we did today, and it's a tradition on the Shabbat before Passover to talk a bit about the themes of that holiday. And as Rabbi Lizzie mentioned, we are not meeting next Shabbat, so this is that sermon a little earlier, but maybe that'll help us prepare a bit, right? I mean, it takes a bit to prepare for Passover. And for those who didn't know that Passover is in a week, it's in a week. That is when Passover is. Hopefully that's not an unpleasant surprise for anybody who's now thinking about the grocery list that you need to get through to prepare. So perhaps some of you were there, or maybe you saw some of the photos, but last weekend, nearly 1,000 people gathered together downtown for Trans Day of Visibility. And today, there is another protest happening at Federal Plaza. I see Jed has already left us on the way to this protest as part of Hands Off, which is a nationwide demonstration against the president's attacks on the welfare system and the federal workforce, immigrants, and other vulnerable yet vital elements of American society. And the back-to-back protests of this weekend and the last kind of took me back to early 2017 during the first Trump administration. At the time, I was in rabbinical school in New York City, and starting with the Women's March on January 21st of that year, my classmates and I developed a weekly tradition of brunch and protest, or sometimes it was protest and brunch depending on when we were marching. And we rallied for LGBTQ+ rights. We demonstrated for women and freedom of choice. We stood against anti-immigrant policies like the Muslim ban. And the marches didn't always achieve their aims. Often they actually did not move the needle much at all, but they did create a temporary reality, a place where the values of freedom and dignity and equality were alive. And we helped each other, and I think this is the most important part of these marches. We helped each other remember what we were fighting for with chants and signs and placards and banners. So one of my favorite signs that I made, it was actually the very first, was for the Women's March, and it was drawn on a piece of cardboard, and it read, "Jews, opposing tyrants since 2000 BCE. I'll admit that 2000 BCE is a generous approximation of when the Israelites were liberated from slavery and left Egypt. If the Exodus was a historic event, and that is a heavily debated if, most scholars place it between the 15th and 13th centuries BCE. And questions about the historicity of the Exodus narrative are fascinating. There are people who've made entire careers out of finding answers for them. But when looking at the stories that we tell about ourselves, the ones that help us understand who we are and how we move through the world, I'm less interested, probably because I'm a rabbi, in the factual than the true. And what I mean by that is that when we move from the annals of history to the realm of myth, there is something to be learned, but it's less the who, what, when, and where, and more the how and the why. The primary purpose of Passover, that is, the why, is to retell the story of the Exodus. That's what the Seder is all about. The Haggadah, the songs, the rituals, the charoset, the horseradish, the matzah, they are all tools. They are the how that help us lean in, at times quite literally, to tell the story, to tell it as if we were retelling it from our own lived experience. For this purpose, we read, God labored on my behalf by taking me out of Egypt. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel once wrote that for the Jew, when we say, I believe, what we actually mean is I remember. Yet while the story remains the same, we don't. Each Passover, we recall the Exodus with hearts that have been transformed, sometimes in ways that are joyful, other times in ways that are tragic by the intervening year. And so the truth we uncover in its retelling will change every single time that we sit at the Seder table. Earlier this week, Rabbi Lizzie told me that she asked folks at Morning Minyan what questions we should ask this Passover. One person wrote, what does freedom look like? Another person wrote, what does oppression look like? And depending on the year we had, the questions we ask and the answers we look for will be different. And as I watch people take to the streets again, signs in hand, I find myself wondering how we will make it through the reign of another Pharaoh, one that threatens to undo the very systems that have kept tyrants in check in this country for centuries. So there's a funny thing about Passover, and it's that we tell the story in just one sitting. We move from slavery to freedom to next year in Jerusalem in the span of a single meal, when according to even the biblical narrative, this process probably took years and years and years. It seems like if we were really going to embody the Exodus, we should go about it very slowly. There's an anecdote in the Haggadah about 5 rabbis who gathered for a Seder many centuries ago in Bnei Brak. They became so engrossed in recounting the Exodus that they stayed up all night. And the rabbis only realized how long it had been when someone came and interrupted them, telling them it was time for Shacharit, the morning prayers. So the Haggadah explains, V'chol hemarbe l'saper b'tziat Mitzrayim harei zeh meshubach. Anyone who adds, who elongates, who extends their telling of the Exodus from Egypt is praiseworthy. And now I think this is less a prescription for piety and more a reminder that the journey from slavery to freedom took time, a lot of time. The story of Passover is one of cumulative change, small acts of defiance and disobedience that brought us step by step closer to freedom. First, there are the midwives, Shifra and Puah. When Pharaoh decrees that all the male Israelite babies should be killed, they lie to protect them. They would have done his bidding, they tell Pharaoh, but were unable to reach the Israelite woman until well after they had given birth. The writer and activist Francine Klagsbroom notes that this may actually be the first recorded instance of civil disobedience. And then there's Yocheved, an Israelite woman who hides her son Moses from the soldiers who had been dispatched to slaughter him and the other newborns. She secrets him away. She places him in a basket and puts him on the Nile rather than handing him over to authorities. And then we have Moses' sister, Miriam, who follows the basket to see that it reaches safety. And when it finds safe harbor, she suggests that Yocheved serve as his wet nurse. And so she ensures that Moses is raised with the knowledge of and a connection to his people of origin. And then, of course, there's Bat Paro, that is Pharaoh's daughter, the one who pulls the basket from the river and takes Moses as her own, saving him from her father's murderous decree. Now, each of these actions, they occur within the very first breath of the Exodus's retelling. They're like a few sentences in the Haggadah. They are the preamble to the primary storyline, which is Moses confronting Pharaoh, right? Let my people go. And Pharaoh refusing to listen. And the divine signs and wonders that will undo the shackles of slavery and wrest the Israelites from the house of bondage. They're moments that are easy to miss. None of these small acts of protest were sufficient in and of themselves to dismantle an entire society built on the oppression of their people. Yet all of them, each of them, were necessary, incremental, at times imperceptible steps on the road to redemption. Shifra and Puah did not save every life, but they saved some, and to those parents, that life was reason enough to persevere. Yocheved did not end her people's enslavement, but she ensured that her son would grow up free, a necessary precondition to Moses' ability to imagine a better future, to see that the gap existed between the world as it was and the world that could be. Bat Paro did not rewrite the laws of Egypt that her father put into place, but her act of disobedience, done at the epicenter of power, would ripple forward and outward to transform her entire country. These are women, a fact that I don't think we should overlook. These are women, many of them slaves, working within the constraints of an incredibly unequal society, a society that disempowers them in so many ways, doing what was possible for them in that moment while aspiring for a world where those barriers, those obstacles no longer existed. This is an important point. Their actions were not only done in defiance of the world that they lived in, they were also a manifestation of the world they hoped for, a brief moment of leaving Mitzrayim, which we translate as Egypt, but means the narrowness that surrounded them, to live expansively, as if that narrowness no longer existed. The Exodus ends with the Israelites gathered on the shore of the Reed Sea, the parted waters closing behind them, and with it, the end of centuries of oppression. Moses begins to offer words of praise, Ashira Ladonai. One day I will sing to God. And of course, the rabbis are puzzled. Why is he speaking in the future tense here? Rabbi Jericho Vincent, who has a really great podcast on how we might survive this moment in history, I think you should all check it out. Rabbi Jericho Vincent offers that this is a way of Moses saying, one day in the future, when I'm really and truly safe, when I've processed this whole experience, when I feel secure, then I'll really celebrate that I was saved from death by the splitting of the sea. And I think this is a totally understandable response. They just saw one of the greatest nations on the planet brought to its knees by terrible plagues. They fled with what they could carry on their backs. They found themselves trapped between a vengeful pursuing army and an impassable sea, and now miraculously safe on the other shore. Probably unsure of how that even happened in the first place, they faced an uncharted and unknown wilderness. Moses is optimistic, but cautiously so. But then Moses looks back, and his sister Miriam and all of the women have taken out their timbrels, and they begin to dance and sing in response to his prayer. Yet her song is not Ashira Ladonai, but Shiru Ladonai, which Rabbi Jericho translates as sing right the F now. Miriam is aware of the difficult road that has led to this moment, and she understands that there is a difficult road still ahead of them, but for the time being, they are there on that shore. And so she sings an act of defiance against all that has been and a reminder of all that might be. Her song is a lodestar, pointing the way toward a better future, knowing that they can get there because of everything it took for them to reach that moment. To quote Miriam, as depicted in what is objectively the greatest animated feature of all time, The Prince of Egypt, and because anybody who knows me knows that I cannot give a Passover sermon without mentioning this movie at least once. To quote Miriam, "We are not afraid, although we know there's much to fear, for we are moving mountains long before we knew we could." The very fact that the woman packed their timbrels is an act of hopeful defiance, a commitment to preserving the tools that will be needed to build the world that the Israelites dreamed of building, even if they didn't seem so helpful at the time. It's a very small act, seemingly insignificant, but imagine if the woman didn't pack their instruments. Thinking about the journey ahead of them, I don't think anyone would have blamed them for picking up a blanket or a bowl in lieu of a tambourine. Yet lacking instruments, no one would have sung on that distant shore. And lacking instruments, we would not be singing those same songs. We sing those same words today. And who knows what would have happened? Who knows what would have happened if the Israelites had wandered into the wilderness without recognition of and gratitude for what they had overcome, or the vision and the hope for where their journey would have ended. The theologian Arthur Cohen once wrote that Jews live in the tension between recollection of the past and anticipation of the future. This dual lens is what allows us to find our way in the present moment, especially when facing the wilderness, and we face a wilderness today. We must remember where we have come from and know where we are going, and understand that the space in between those points is connected by 1,000 small steps. It's not just a long view of history, but I think the longest view that we hold, from creation to redemption to revelation to the messianic promise of what could be. The writer Rebecca Solnit once described herself as a tortoise at a mayfly party. What she means by that is that tortoises could live for over a century, and mayflies live for just a few days. And for most of the time, we act like mayflies. We are very focused on the here and now, what is immediately happening around us, whether our actions have seeable and tangible consequences in the moment. But if we are to survive this moment, she explains that we must take an expansive view of history to understand the consequences of small actions which may seem insignificant in the short term, but are necessary steps on the way to substantive change. For me, this is the how and the why of the Seder this year. How do we make it through the reign of another Pharaoh? Just like our ancestors, step by step by step. And why? Well, because this is how we've outlasted every single tyrant who has wished us harm since about 2000 BCE. The Seder is a series of small acts. Here we break the matzah, and here we lean to our left, and here we spill some wine, and here we sing Hallel. They are small actions, not sufficient in themselves for bringing about the world that we want to live in, but by doing them, we open a pathway within ourselves for the future we envision, the future that we are fighting for. The Seder plate, the Haggadah, the conversation over dinner becomes a window, allowing us a glimpse, however brief, of that better world right now. We break the matzah and we imagine a world where all who are hungry have a table to sit at, enough food to eat, and we lean to our left and imagine a world where everybody is free to rest, to relax, to be joyful. We take our wine and we spill a drop for each of the 10 plagues and imagine a world where our hearts are large and expansive enough to hold all people, even the people we call our enemies, with compassion and with care. We sing Hallel, songs of praise, and for just a few minutes, within the darkness of this world, we create space for joy, an act of defiance against those in power who would demand our silence, and a reminder that where we find ourselves now is not where we always must be. The journey is ours to take. Like bringing instruments into the wilderness, each action is a reminder that what we do matters. I sincerely believe that what we do matters even if we cannot see it now. By doing what we can, where we can, however we can. By retelling the story of our people, which is, after all, our story. By remembering where we have been and where we're going. Step by step, we walk just a bit closer to that redeemed world. I hope you have a Chag Kasher v'Sameach, a meaningful, healthy, and happy Passover, and Shabbat Shalom.